Okay, so we have about just over 20 minutes for questions. I'm going to ask one, which is my kind of privilege, I suppose, of being at the front and get away with it, which is that, I mean, it's a kind of rhetorical question in a sense. I don't really think this is true, but it struck me, one thing that surprised me, because I read the book and I kind of know the argument, that surprised me was we could almost get the sense towards the end that there's a kind of new protectionism potentially emerging here, because and it kind of comes round in a circle, because media studies often is treated as a kind of potentially protectionist discipline, particularly around media literacy, and of course in the broadcast era, as you described it, that was about the dangers of television and more recently the dangers of social media. And what I kind of got a sense of towards the end was the way you're advocating media studies as a campaigning discipline could be seen as a kind of protectionism 2.0, in the sense that you're now talking about the individual needing to be protected from the power, not the state, but the global power structures who are surveying us, and so hacktivism as a kind of protectionism. Is that a reasonable suggestion?
Yeah, to an extent, yes. But I think the nature of threats has changed. So media studies originates because media was seen as a threat. But it was either a threat because of the power of the organisation politically, or its power over the mind. And I think what we have to realise is that there are different threats today. The problem in terms of I have is that all I can give is an individual perspective and my argument. And that becomes my argument for what the media discipline should be. And obviously you can't do that. You can't have one person saying what a discipline is. It's completely illogical. So there's a flaw fundamentally in what I'm saying when I said this is what it should be. But what I like, at least in the book, is that I try to do something kind of which I call kind of like open sourcing the discipline, where most textbooks will simply tell you what a discipline thinks. And what I want to do is tell you where it comes from, why it thinks certain things and why it might be wrong. And I like the idea of actually teaching students that they don't actually have to agree with the discipline and that it's wrong for many reasons. And maybe in that way, the future generations of students who come through might actually have a different opinion and a different way of making the discipline. So all I can do now is kind of give my tiny perspective. But until there's more people who begin to think like this, so kind of what that discipline might be can't be fleshed out. But hopefully there's generations of students who might come through and kind of put this into practice a bit more readily. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay, over to you. Questions, comments, challenges?
Are you a coder?
Sorry?
Do you do any coding?
No, not at all. And I come from my background is more kind of theoretical. I did a politics degree because I liked Marx and philosophy. Then I did critical theory and discovered Baudrillard. And I was a happy little theorist and philosopher. And gradually I've kind of come to realise that we've missed out on a lot of things, and maybe the skills I've got kind of don't fit into what kind of media studies really demands. But it's in the same way that if kind of someone's driving in a car and you're a passenger and they choose to go off a cliff, even if you can't drive, you're still allowed to say, do you know what, where we're driving is wrong. So I still think that even kind of being in a position of someone who isn't that technologically able, I can still at least see that, well, actually, this is what we should be doing.
Well, because I was thinking, and you mentioned how academia, I feel like, isn't sort of prepared for the coding and all the back end and the technology. And because I come from computer animation, we have a very multidisciplinary approach to the study. So we have coders and mathematicians and physicists, and then we have people teaching film studies and the aesthetics and cultural studies and the rest. And so, if you like, there is a space that you could propose, which is an academic space, which encourages collaborative, if you like, media studies models, where the coders are working with your more traditional media studies type, I suppose. It's not
impossible. That's got to be the future. But what you find is that universities are essentially a 19th century machine. They're like with the factory and the mill, you get the university, and they spend a lot of time separating out their disciplines, which meant literally disciplining the discipline. So it meant this and not that. And certain things don't talk to each other. And what we have today in most universities is, we have huge departments, and actually trying to get links between them can be phenomenally hard. So, a lot of media studies people aren't looking towards computing thinking, that's where we need our connection. And computing isn't particularly looking at media and thinking, gosh, we need media studies. But it's those kind of boundaries that we need to break down in a kind of 21st century kind of discipline, and or even the notion of a discipline should be something we should be picking apart.
And have you looked at, I was looking at digital archives and I came across a media archaeologist, a guy called Ernst.
Yes, I've met him, yes.
And I thought of him when you were talking about the hacking.
Yes.
He talks about collecting all the technologies and then hacking them and looking at the components. And how they're used in different ways and different technologies, and that tells you about the thing itself.
Yes, because as a weird...
Sorry, this might be a bit nerdy.
No, it's good. As a weird kind of postmodernist, in my very first job, I thought I was going to get lots of theory modules, and the first module I got was called 19th Century Media. And I panicked instantly, but I became a bit of a fan, and in particular visual media, and I've got magic lanterns, stereoscopes, all this stuff. And I realised I needed to get them, because you can't teach a medium unless you've actually tried to use it, which apparently people have said is technological determinism. But for me, it's just basics. So when I met Wolfgang Ernst, we spent the whole time just showing photos of each other's stuff to each other. But why I kind of would differ from him, I like the media archaeological approach, but he is kind of anti-humanist in a sense. He doesn't want to discuss the human, it's always about materiality. I'm more interested, cybernetics isn't popular today, but it was built on a kind of biological idea of how kind of systems and environments are built up. So I'm sitting here, luckily for everyone, I'm kind of in a relationship with my clothes, I'm in a relationship with the chair, with the room. It's a question of kind of systems in which we build links with each other, and I am both me plus me and my clothes, plus me and this room, And that for me is a way of kind of like avoiding the trap either of neglecting the human completely or just focusing on the human. So I like technology and the human in their relationships together without over-privileging one of each, if that makes sense.
And then I have another question,
yeah, sorry.
if you don't mind. I was looking at digital archives, on the notion of digital archives, and I saw a kind of similar, if you like, parallel between what you were talking about with the literature and media studies, sort of having ages, if you like, of optimism with the web and the internet, and seeing the web and the internet as potentially like an archive. The information is all out there for us to use and get hold of. And now more recent, kind of much more negative. Like a bit, postmodern, I suppose, literature on Big Brother type models and Google buying over YouTube and changes in policy in YouTube. So where YouTube users had channels that were doing one thing, now it works in a different way. But I was also thinking about actually, even because you mentioned running a Google search, and I thought, well, even that is predetermined. So the algorithms in the search engines are determining the information that each of us individually see every time. So we might all input the same words, but be presented with a different set of results. And those results are a result of the algorithm looking at how you've navigated through the internet and what you've been looking at in your history of your digital footprint, if you like.
Yes.
Yeah. It's got me thinking about lots of things.
Mark, you got
a question to the disciplinary schism that you're advocating. Why even hang on to media studies? Isn't the thing you're advocating so different from traditional media studies, perhaps as different as media studies was from English, say? Yes. What about a new start completely?
Yeah, it's a really good point. But the weird thing is, I tried to say in my book, bizarrely, I'm kind of a bit old-fashioned. In a strange sense, I'm not attacking media studies, I'm actually defending it, because I'm trying to say to it, look, guys, if we're still going to be here, we've got to change a little bit. What I find about the approach is simply says, well, because somebody says to me, at one conference somebody said to me, well, we're not stopping you from doing anything. If you want to study this stuff, go off and do it. And it's like, yeah, but you're not changing if we all just kind of agree to let each other do what we want. And actually, a few minority of people having this kind of interest isn't enough. Because you've got to say to yourself, there's a lot of stuff happening that is explicitly political. And who's going to do anything about this? Because it isn't French or German, it's not biology, it's not chemistry, it's not geography, it's not history, maybe politics, but really the one discipline all of these issues come down to is media studies. And if media studies isn't even looking in that direction, then I think there's a problem. And I'd rather, in a sense, kind of stay within and try and change it than try to be a kind of tiny group, or else effectively you're just the militant of kind of media studies, which will eventually just kind of wither and die and be ignored, maybe, I don't know. There's also the fact that media studies is doing digital stuff. and increasingly so. So you could think, oh well, they're kind of getting there. But I gave a paper kind of at one kind of place, and I was naturally kind of like, you know, the audience were up in uproar and throwing things at me and really angry. And the next person just kind of gave an analysis of kind of 2 YouTube videos, and the kind of questions came and going, well, this is obviously just disproves William, because we are dealing with digital media and we're doing so brilliantly. And I thought, no, what we've just got is just another text. He's read 2 YouTube videos as a text. In the time it took him to show one video, another 180 hours of video had gone onto YouTube. That's just not even in his kind of rationale. There's no conception of YouTube. There's no discussion of what the audience is, because you can't know it. There's no discussion of who the producer is, because you can't know it. And this guy even stood there and said, there's been no commentary on this whatsoever. And there's like 50 pages of comments beneath the video, and you think, there is. But, you know, academics haven't put it in their journals. And I just thought, whatever we see, like something like YouTube as just text to be analysed, we're not really engaging with kind of what the digital world is. So I'd rather stay within and kind of shout, in a sense, than simply kind of move outside, you know, because we're going to do it anyway, and I think sometimes we're going to do it badly.
My only concern then is that we lose, because I'm quite committed to looking at rhetoric, for example, yes. and I think that brings us back to McLuhan as well. Yeah. And at the end of the book, you talk about sort of a methodological plurality where we launch McLuhan-esque probes into things, which I like very much, I think. But I'm just anxious sometimes that through this scale, we throw out the kind of forensic analysis, which is drawn from textual analysis.
It is. And, you know, I'm not necessarily saying, although I'm a bit of an extremist, I'm not simply saying that consumption skills are no longer needed, because we are still consuming images with meanings and repercussions. So we still need to teach consumption skills. But we kind of do that enough already. I think we've probably nailed that as much as we can, and we do need a bit of a shift. But it's not necessarily a shift in which we completely lose everything. But I do sometimes think that, you know, our kind of determination to keep things that maybe are past their sell-by date is quite interesting. I mean, semiology is good and it works, but, you know, I remember saying at one conference, you know, well, what if we don't have to use it? There's histories of ways in which we've used images and understood them before semiology came along. Maybe it's the time to kind of go back to them or change or just drop it. And I simply said it was like a provocation. But, you know, I barely got out of the room alive for suggesting that, you know, we don't need semiology. You know, people were screaming at me going, we need semiology. So it's kind of more of a kind of provocation perhaps, but I see what you're saying, yeah.
I have a question in my head that I'd really like to hear from students, and I think maybe rather than ask students to think of a kind of a question themselves, we might put a question to you, which is, you know, what do you buy this, or how do you feel about it? Because we talked a couple of weeks ago in my session, didn't we, about one of Will's more inflammatory quotes, which is about, you know, the getting students to make TV programs in fake TV studios being a waste of your fees, and of course you do that quite a lot here. So, you know, one thing that we shouldn't lose sight of is that, however, you know, polite we might be being, there is something, you know, at stake here for you, which is that if what Will is saying about media studies at the moment is true, then we're taking your money and not really doing what we should be doing to help you. So, you know, how do you feel about that? Do you have a response? Do you buy it, or do you want to just, you know, explore any particular angles of that? Well, while he's here. Well, if not, I'll just ask my question, but I'll give you 30 seconds to ponder it. Was that your hand going up, Matt?
It was.
You go on.
I'm not sure, but as
you're quite young, aren't you?
yeah, as a recent-ish 10 years student of media studies here, in fact. So, you know, yay Bournemouth. But I consider myself a coder, you know, my job is coding and stuff. Right, okay. I just wonder, and I'm not sure if I agree with myself, but I just wonder, why can't media studies just be left as it is? And it's just an acceptance that media studies is this kind of, you know, it has this legacy of studying in the way it does. Surely we should be focusing on computing and talking about bringing media into computing more. So, you know, why, if the skills you kind of mentioned, you know, there's kind of data protection, all of that stuff, data analysis, it's very much a computing thing. Why is the emphasis not more on computer degrees need to bolster their media stuff? I appreciate there's going to be there's a mix between that, and there's a kind of hybrid which should be kind of focused on. But, you know, why is the argument not media studies? People go into media studies knowing what it is. They accept that that's their interest. Why do they have to learn about data encryption and stuff like that? Surely computer people go into computing because that's what they're interested in.
Yeah.
So why can't we just leave media studies alone?
Talk me into it. I'll resign. Yeah, no, it's a good point. My experience in my university, I've made links with computer science, and we've tried to get our students going to do some computing, but they kind of don't really want to. But I have had computing students doing my modules, and they really enjoy it, and they say they wish they had something equivalent in their own departments. But I think it's also a question of kind of skill and conception of the discipline. So their conception of computing doesn't necessarily involve social and cultural issues as much, and their skills to teach certain things obviously don't exist, so they can't necessarily deal with the social and cultural issues because they don't have the skills. So computing, I think, is in a similar kind of has a similar kind of issue, but I don't think it's necessarily facing up to it, and I can't do much about computing because I'm not in it. But then, should we just leave media studies alone? Quite possibly, except for the fact that the kind of issues and threats I'm talking about apply to absolutely everybody. And it's not just media students, it's absolutely everybody. And I do just kind of think, well, someone at some point has to kind of begin to kind of push this forward actually as a political agenda. And I can't see a discipline that's going to do it. And if media studies doesn't, I think it's going to be almost irrelevant in some senses. Not necessarily irrelevant. Let's look at it in terms of, I like art history, for example. And it's a kind of an aesthetic discipline. And if I think about like what my children should know, I want them to know the history of art, I want them to know the history of literature, history of music. But this is all aesthetics, and it's a good thing to know. And I think the ability to know about kind of TV and film, how to understand it, how to interpret it, it's a kind of critical aesthetics. It's all really important, and ideally I'd like my children to know it. So it's not that it's not important. But I think there's actually kind of other levels which I think are more important, which I kind of want him to know first. My 13-year-old son is doing a computing kind of in his school, which just teaches him to use Excel and Word. So he does nothing else than that. And he's doing media studies as part of English, which just teaches him to kind of like how to interpret kind of, the odd image. In the meantime, him and his friends are on Kick every night sending messages. And when he sends a message that's wildly inappropriate or even kind of legally kind of wrong, he says to me, it's just to a friend, he won't tell anyone. And yet all of his messages have screenshots of what everyone else is saying, inserted into all the other messages. And you just kind of think, these are the skills that we need to be teaching our kids, not how to understand a film poster and kind of like how to use Excel. So kind of I think media studies is a discipline that's kind of for me has got to do that, but I don't think it will. I think I'm on to a kind of losing game here, quite honestly.
Can I ask you the what is probably the most obvious question? The way I'm sure you've been asked it many times before, and you can ask it of David Gauntlet, Henry Jenkins, Manovich, all of those people, and yourself who talk about the new era. And yet at the same time, why write a book?
Yeah, well, I started with a blog, I can at least claim that. And the irony is that my one blog post actually got me known in my discipline far more than 15 years of work in a book on Baudrillard. Which, and I was writing a book on Baudrillard on the media thinking, gosh, he's the most important media theorist of the late 20th century. I can't believe that no one else has got there before me. I'll have this book, and then everyone in media studies will realise that Baudrillard is wonderful. And I published a book, and media studies doesn't even look, doesn't even glance up. Now, cultural studies, theory, a few people read it, etc. But basically kind of, media studies, obviously I realised later isn't interested in Baudrillard, and isn't interested that much in theory, to be honest. And then I wrote one blog post, which took me all of 20 minutes, and all of a sudden it's pinging all around the internet, and you kind of think, I've wasted my time really before now. And I even say in the book that, the problem is that we are kind of, as academics, we're tied into reputation structures and professional structures which value the book over, say, the blog. So my blog would be free and available to everyone to read. I could have put all those chapters in the blog, free, globally available, and it would have meant nothing for my career, and I probably wouldn't have this invite today or various others. I might still have a career, but the book at least is professionally what we're stuck in. And I think there's at the end of the book I kind of have a kind of chapter on how we need to think about our relationship with media and education, the university, and then the wider public. And I think this is also something that academia isn't doing very well, by being forced to publish in journals that nobody reads. Most academic articles that we produce aren't read. They're not even read by each other. They're not even read sometimes by the editors. of the journals, and I kind of had a bit of evidence for this, but I decided not to put that in my book, because that would have been the end, taking on one particular journal. But, we're not reading this stuff. And then the government also wants us to have impact, whilst forcing us to publish in journals that we don't want reading. And I tried specifically to write this book as one that was readable. I tried to make it so that it was a book that students could read, or even anyone who wasn't particularly interested in media studies could read. The original title was actually Media 2.0, so that it wasn't just fixed to media studies, but Routledge wouldn't go with that. And I wrote it without any referencing. There's about 3 in, which the kind of proofreader put back in at the end, but those references are not mine. I didn't want them in there. So I was trying to find ways to kind of build towards a wider audience. But in a sense, you kind of stuck with a book.
Yeah. Okay, well, we have just under 5 minutes left, and I think, we don't want to be guilty of doing what we do at a lot of conferences these days as media academics, is we talk about young people on their behalf, but never have any young people there or ever hear from them. So, broadly speaking, you all look younger than us, so I think it would be only fitting if the last word came from one of the students. So can we have one question, or just a comment, or an observation, or something, please? Go on.
I'm currently doing a course that specializes in doing different kinds of media, but I do believe that at the moment one of the most important parts of the course is the critical theory part of it. What do you think about us having to kind of work within different mediums and platforms, but also having the same emphasis on theory and the critical thinking? Do you think that critical thinking is the important thing that would kind of push us to be more like the people that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think theory is incredibly important. If media and computing have merged, one possible implication is that we need to kind of use more computational methods and work with big data and use kind of computing more and more. But I'm not entirely convinced by that, because I'm a complete theorist, and I'm a 100% theorist, and there is no empirical research behind that book. And if you don't like it, as McLuhan wonderfully said, he was doing a seminar once in the 1940s to this American university, which included Merton, who was the biggest sociologist of his generation. And McLuhan gave a speech, and then Merton kind of responded with a few criticisms. And McLuhan just went, "You don't like those ideas? I got others." And it was like a quote from Groucho Marx: "You don't like my morals? I've got more." But I kind of like theory as something which you can simply throw at something. It's faster. It forces you to kind of reinterpret and look from different angles. And in that point of view, I think the one thing that's been historically missing from a lot of media studies, ironically, is theory. So you will do theory in terms of, if you do a course that's slightly more theoretical, obviously, but also slightly more cultural studies, you're going to get a little bit more theory. But ironically, media studies as a discipline doesn't really deal with theory very well. And one conference I went to, when I gave a paper, people were saying I didn't know what media studies was, so I started saying, okay, so we'll go through the books and you stick your hand up if you've read one. And I started from kind of like Lippmann and Laswell and kind of Bernays, and I was going through kind of Lazarsfeld and Bloomer, and I was going through into the kind of like personal influence. Before I got to, kind of understanding media, McLuhan, nobody had actually got their hand up for even a single book. And you think, yeah, media studies lecturers aren't reading theory. They're not reading the stuff. And what I like about theory is it's kind of got an instantaneity about it. It's like it enables you to deal in the moment with something, where you're trying it out and throwing ideas at something. This is why I still love McLuhan. You can be wrong, but at least it's a response. And I think that's kind of one of the problems we have in a world that's moving so fast. Because how does somebody respond to my book? Well, hopefully they'll write another book. And in 5 years' time, it'll be sitting there on the shelves. It's not good enough. We need to move from a world where we're only valued for writing books and journal articles to one where we're actually out there talking fast to everything that's happening instantaneously. And I think theory is a really big part of that.
Thank you. Well, it's 11 o'clock. We should finish, but can we just thank Will for coming and sharing his...
Thank you very much.
Once again.